Welcome to the debate. This episode, we're delving into the really enduring and often paradoxical legacy of Henry Ford. We're examining the systemic blueprint he established, what we call Fordism, a framework that simultaneously revolutionized industrial production and, well, dramatically redefined labor, consumption, and corporate control across the globe.
Right, and the core issue we're tackling here is whether that Fordist system, with its iconic assembly line and its unique corporate governance, whether that represents an ideal template for industry and society, a real engine of democratization, or if it's just an inherently flawed model. I'll be arguing it's a model built on institutionalized control, pervasive worker alienation, and frankly, systemic corporate inequality.
And I'll be countering that Ford's system was a truly revolutionary structure. It created an unprecedented industrial scale efficiency and, crucially, a democratized mobility for the masses for the very first time in human history. To achieve that kind of monumental change, certain tensions and, yes, structural controls were simply inevitable components of success. When we look back at the 20th century, Henry Ford was, and this is without exaggeration, a revolutionary force. His impact went so far beyond just car manufacturing. He changed the entire scale of modern life. His genius wasn't just in inventing the Model T, but in achieving an industrial scale that was completely unprecedented in history. He fundamentally transformed the economies of scale. And this transformation led directly to the democratization of mobility. The Model T didn't just move people, it unlocked personal geography. It dramatically reduced rural isolation, enabled new patterns of commuting, and fundamentally changed dating, family life, urbanization, everything. It offered this tangible, personal independence that was previously restricted only to the wealthy elite. Decades later, you see that same commitment in the successful launch of the Mustang. Marketed specifically to younger consumers at a reasonable price point, it's all about maintaining that spirit of mass accessibility.
Right.
To really grasp this ambition, you have to look at the factories he built. The massive River Rouge complex wasn't just a factory. It was the entire guts and heart of industrial civilization. A single sprawling complex where raw materials, iron ore and coal, entered on one end and finished functional automobiles drove out the other. It was the most advanced, the most sophisticated manufacturing facility in the country, a unified, self-contained vision of total industrial efficiency. It was a template for mass prosperity the world had never seen before.
I see why you frame it that way, in terms of democratization and unprecedented scale, but we have to interrogate the internal workings of that template. Because ultimately, it rests on coercion, not liberation. When you praise the efficiency of the production paradigm, you also have to acknowledge that Fordism is deeply, deeply tied to the philosophy of Taylorism, or scientific management. Taylorism's core principle was maximizing productivity through intense time-motion studies, breaking down labor into its smallest, most repetitive, most controllable components. And yes, productivity soared, but the result for the laborer was profound alienation. The production system imposed these rigid norms of order and precision by stripping the worker of their intellectual engagement, of any ownership over their own skill. As one intellectual observed, all the changes in modes of existence and life within this system took place through a kind of coercion, a brute coercion. It required this grievous subjugation of instinct and personal control to rigid mechanical norms. And Ford's own philosophy made this control explicit. He demanded absolute efficiency, stating, "Time loves to be wasted." And, more ominously, from time wasted there can be no salvage. The whole structure of Fordism was built on these relentless, non-negotiable demands placed on the human body and the human mind.
That is a compelling argument about the structural pressures of the line, but I would frame the relationship between the worker and the system a bit differently. I'd focus on the revolutionary counterpoint to those demands, the famous high wage, the $5 day. I contend this was an essential component of the Fordist economic revolution. It was necessary economic empowerment, not mere managerial coercion.
But was it empowerment?
Well, yes, the work was grueling. It required a high degree of muscular and nervous energy expenditure, but Ford recognized this cost, and he responded by offering the possibility of a better standard of living, a standard of living adequate to these new methods of work. The high wage was a deliberate strategy to reduce the crushing turnover rate that plagued the early assembly lines. It stabilized the workforce, and it created this organic, well-articulated pool of skilled and semi-skilled labor that was, sorely lacking in other, less efficient industries. It was just smart economics that created the loyalty and stability required for that monumental scale. And at the same time, it shared the prosperity with the workforce.
I recognize the unprecedented economic draw of the $5 day, of course, but we have to immediately interrogate the cost of that wage. The money wasn't just handed out in a vacuum. It was inextricably linked to pervasive social control. And that renders it calculated social engineering, not societal uplift or simple labor economics.
How so?
Well, the distribution of that high wage was fundamentally regulated by the Ford Sociological Department. This was not HR. This was a quasi-policing agency. They employed inspectors who made unannounced visits, acting as cultural spies who prowled working-class neighborhoods to probe the most intimate corners of workers' lives.
Right.
They had a strict moral and social code that determined who got the full wage. They monitored private life. Was the worker's house clean? Did they show any signs of drinking problems? Were they legally married? Were they sending too much money back to the old country, which suggested a lack of commitment to Americanization? Workers who failed this inspection, who did not conform to Ford's specific vision of American propriety, had their additional wages withheld, and if they failed to amend their ways, they were terminated. So the $5 day, you see, wasn't a universal right. It was a mechanism Henry Ford used to coerce conformity and force a rigid definition of American identity upon his immigrant laborers.
It was a brutal form of assimilation, I grant you that. But the purpose, from a systemic standpoint, was integration. Integrating the worker into the system of mass consumption he had created. We contrast the image of that invasive surveillance with the result. The ability of the worker, now stabilized and compensated, to participate in the consumer economy, to purchase the very products he created. The Model T wasn't just a machine, it was a physical manifestation of independence that offset the demands of the assembly line. Ford established the essential modern cycle of mass production and mass consumption that drove the entire 20th century.
But this cycle came at a measurable human cost to the producer. You yourself mentioned new demands on muscular and nervous energy. The material suggests that the organization of work at Ford, by maximizing speed and repetition, meant that labor power was consumed in average hours that were undeniably more wearying and exhausting than elsewhere. You get a high wage, sure, but you sell your personal autonomy, your ability to pace yourself, and your fundamental skill to a coercive clock.
Mm-hmm.
And what's more, the contradiction is built right into the architect himself. Henry Ford was the creator of this relentless, efficient, overwhelming industrial age, yet he personally yearned for the past. He dedicated immense resources to creating his beloved, nostalgic Greenfield Village, a museum of pre-industrial craft and simplicity. At the same time, historic accounts confirm that he actually hates the Rouge, the very industrial monolith he built. The system was so fundamentally draining that even its creators sought refuge in its antithesis. And that just reveals the profound human cost imposed on millions of workers who couldn't escape to their own personal museum of nostalgia. And if we transition now from the shop floor, where control was exercised over labor, to the boardroom, we see that the demand for centralized control extends over capital as well. I believe the governance structure is really just the institutionalized continuation of Henry Ford's original demand for absolute, non-negotiable authority.
You're talking about the share structure?
Exactly. I'm referring, of course, to the dual-class share structure. For most public companies, one share equals one vote. But at Ford, the family shares hold a staggering 36 votes per share, compared to the tiny 1 vote per share held by regular external shareholders. This structure reduces management accountability by giving insiders power that's, well, it's completely disproportionate to their actual financial risk.
Okay, and what's the practical effect of that?
Well, what it means, practically, is that even when a significant portion of the external capital pool disagrees with management, they are powerless to force a change. For instance, The proposal to secure equal voting rights has received more than 51% of the independent, non-family vote every single year since 2011. Yet Ford management, protected by this super voting power, has done absolutely nothing to address this serious issue of institutionalized minority control. This lack of accountability is a tangible liability. In 2021, management pay was rejected by 494 million against votes, and several family directors, including William Clay Ford Jr., received significant negative votes. This shareholder dissent is a loud warning bell that just goes unheeded because the voting structure renders dissent meaningless.
Those are certainly damning numbers for accountability. I see that. But are those votes truly destabilizing the company? Or are they a necessary symptom of maintaining a founding vision against short-term market pressures? I come at this structure from a different angle, emphasizing its historical necessity and its stabilizing effect.
Okay.
That supervoting power traces back directly to the existential threat the company faced in the 1930s. When Franklin Roosevelt instituted the wealth tax of 1935, a core element was an inheritance tax of 70% on large estates. Given the sheer size of Ford's holdings, this tax made it functionally impossible for the company to pass smoothly to his son Edsel. The family would have been forced to liquidate 2/3 of the company's assets just to pay the tax bill. That would have shattered the founding structure and vision.
Right, the creation of the Ford Foundation.
Precisely. Henry Ford II's strategic maneuvering to set up the Ford Foundation as a tax-deductible entity allowed the family to preserve control and saved $321 million in inheritance taxes. This historical maneuver ensured the company's direction remained guided by that founding vision rather than being broken up by taxation or external forces. The family's supervoting power today acts as a crucial, intentional stabilizing force, projecting the enterprise from the relentless quarterly demands of financial markets that so often cripple long-term innovation.
That's a compelling historical account, establishing the original intent as tax avoidance and preservation of control. I get that. However, we have to weigh that intent against the modern consequence of indefinite unaccountability. Today, corporate governance advocates are pressing all dual-class IPO companies to include mandatory time-based sunset provisions, mechanisms that automatically phase out unequal voting rights after a period of time, say 10 to 20 years. This reflects the broad recognition that indefinite family dominance is an inherent liability. The persistence of the 36 vote per share structure, despite consistent shareholder opposition and clear external advice. It demonstrates an ongoing commitment to centralized, non-market-based control that mirrors the authoritarianism inherent in the original Fordist production methods. The system rejects the logic of the capital market just as the sociological department rejected the autonomy of the worker.
But that rejection of short-term market logic is precisely the benefit. The stability offered by family control ensures that the pioneering, long-term strategic spirit, the ability to commit massive capital to revolutionary shifts like electrification, which takes decades to realize a profit, has a continuous guiding hand. It avoids the turbulence and the demands for immediate returns that often lead to short-sighted decisions in companies solely governed by external capital. The cost of limited accountability is, in my view, the price you pay for ensuring the survival of the legacy itself. Ultimately, the Ford legacy presents us with what I think is a necessary paradox. To achieve that monumental scale, that global relevance, efficiency, and control weren't separate ideas. They were two mechanisms on the same engine. The high efficiency demanded control over labor, the pioneering vision demanded control over capital.
And the maintenance of the family structure, I think, secures a continuous long-term strategic spirit against the turbulence of short-term financial markets.
I see it differently. When we examine Ford's systems, from the shop floor to the highest levels of governance, the underlying commitment is to the maintenance of centralized, concentrated control. Coercion over labor through the sociological department, and disproportional power over capital through the dual-class stock structure. This history suggests that while Ford generated wealth and profound technological change, the core Fordist model
defined by worker alienation and limited accountability, it's a systemic relic that requires a fundamental reassessment in the modern context.
We have explored the deep tensions inherent in Ford's legacy, the simultaneous creation of unprecedented individual liberty through the democratization of mobility, and the imposition of intense institutional control in both the assembly line and the boardroom.
The fundamental questions really do remain unresolved. Can democratization and efficiency truly occur without the accompanying structure of profound social control and personal alienation? And can the stability promised by singular family control ever truly justify the governance liability it imposes on a modern global enterprise?
We leave these questions open for you to explore within the material. This has been The Debate. Find more insightful analysis emerging from the WhyItTV canon at whyit.tv.